example number 2, just in case you need another example. So first off, we're going to identify our zeros and the multiplicity for each zero. So I'm going to make a little table. Okay, so I'm going to first look at my first zero. And it doesn't really matter which order you put in the zeros, but I'm just going to do it from left to right. So my first zero right here is at negative 10. And so if you look at the graph, what's it doing at negative 10? It's touching the x-axis and then bouncing off of it. So that implies that our multiplicity is a positive 2. Okay, so now we're going to go to my next x-intercept, which is right here. And I'm going to say that is negative 3. And since it just goes straight through, that means my multiplicity is 1. Then I'm going to go to my next x-intercept, which is right here, positive 4. And since it bounces off, that means that my multiplicity is a 2. And then the last one is right here at positive 11. And since it just goes through the x-axis, my multiplicity is a positive 1. Okay. So let's now look at end behavior. What are my arrows doing at the end? So, on the left side, my arrow is facing down. So as x approaches negative infinity. So basically what that means is if you start like when x is 0 and then you go follow the graph along, that this to the left, that means x is going smaller, so that means x is approaching negative infinity. My y values are pointing down, so that means my y values are getting smaller, so that means my end behavior is negative infinity. Okay, I'm going to write the other side over here. So as x gets bigger, so if I put my pointer right here, x is 0 as at that point, and so if I move to the right, my x's are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So as x gets bigger, what are my y values doing? And my y values are getting smaller, so that means it is negative infinity. Okay. And then extrema, remember, we could have 4 different types of extrema. We could have a relative min, relative max, absolute min, absolute max. So for extrema, I'm going to look for the highest and the lowest points, or the curves, or where it changes directions. And so here is my first curve right here. And so since that is a max point and it is a relative max because it is the relative highest point on some interval, and then right here is a relative min because that's the lowest point for some interval. And then here's another one, and that is the absolute max because that is the absolutely highest point. There is no higher point than this point. And this one is just a little bit lower than that, so that's a relative max. And then this point right here is a relative min. And so your relative maxes and mins are going to be usually when the graph changes directions, like it changes from increasing to decreasing or vice versa. And then intervals for increasing and decreasing. So I'm going to start on the left side because I read from left to right, so I interpret graphs from left to right. I'm going to start on this left arrow, and I'm going to follow this graph along, and my pen is going up, so that is increasing. Okay, so it's increasing until I get to this relative max. So remember, when you have a relative max, relative min, absolute max, or absolute min, it's going to change directions. So once I get to this relative max, then my pen goes down. So that means right here I am decreasing. And that's DEC, sorry, I just wrote over each other. And then when I get here, this is a relative min. And then after I get to the relative min, remember I said it changes directions. So now I'm increasing because my pen is going up. Absolute max, so once I get to one of these extrema, it's going to change directions again. So now I'm going down, so that is decreasing. Until right here, and then there's another extrema right there, so that means it's going to change directions again, and that means it's going up, so that's increasing. And then here's another extrema, so that means it's going to change directions again, and that means I'm going down to the end, so that means it is decreasing. Okay. And then the last thing to do is to write a possible equation in factored form. So in order to do that, you need your zeros and you need your multiplicity. So I'm going to write all of these zeros as a factor. So my first factor, or my first zero, sorry, is x minus 10. So that means my first factor is x plus 10. And then my multiplicity for a 0 of negative 10 is 2. So that's x plus 10 squared. And then my second factor is going to be x plus 3, because that's my next 0, and then my multiplicity is 1, so there's a 1. You can put a 1 there, you don't have to. And then my next 0 is positive 4, so when I put it in factored form, it's going to be negative 4. And my multiplicity there is 2, so I'm going to put a 2 there. And then my last one is x minus 11. And that is my possible equation in factored form.